On the morning of the 9th of October, 1943, Clarice Ristad stepped out her back door with a pan of dishwater and stopped so suddenly that half of it went down her leg. The porch was fixed, not repaired the way a woman with 2 hands and no husband repairs a porch, which is to say a board nailed across the hole and a warning given to anybody who came up the steps. Fixed. The rotted stringer had been cut back to sound wood and scarfed to a new piece. 7 boards had been replaced, and the new ones were old ones, planed and turned and set with their heart side, up the way a man does it when he means the work to outlive him. Whoever had done it had even pulled the 2 loose nails from the step below, straightened them, and driven them back home. She stood there with the pan in her hands and the cold water running into her shoe. She had gone to bed at 10. She had not heard a hammer. On the Dover Slough Road in that part of North Dakota, you could hear a truck downshift 2 miles off, and she had not heard a hammer. Clarice was 28 years old. Her husband Odd had been gone since the March before, first to Camp Adair, and then to a place he was not allowed to name in his letters, which meant the Pacific, which was the same as saying a hole in the map. She had 11 acres of garden, a house her father-in-law had built badly in 1911, and a bad shoulder from cranking a tractor that did not want to start. She had, that morning, exactly $1.16 in the sugar bowl. She had not had a porch, and now she had a porch. She walked the whole length of it twice, looking for a note, a mark, a scrap of anything. There was nothing. There was only the smell of new-cut pine in the cold. And out on the section line, 900 feet off, a single set of boot tracks in the frost that went away east and did not come back. Ransby County was the flat part. People who have only seen the Red River Valley from a highway will tell you it is nothing but a table, and they are close to right. It is the bottom of a lake that has been gone 11,000 years, and it lies so level that in some townships a man could set a plow in the ground and walk it 4 miles without correcting once. The soil is black to a depth that seems like a rumor. What the valley does not have is wood. Every stick of pine and fir and cedar in Ransby County came in on a rail car and was paid for twice. And a man who could make wood do what he wanted was a man worth knowing. Halvor Skjelstad had been that man for 31 years. He had raised the Lutheran church at Voss Prairie in 1917 with a crew of 9 and a borrowed gin pole, and the steeple on it had never taken a lean, not through the July twister of 1928, which took 2 barns off their sills within a half-mile of it. He had framed the schoolhouse, the creamery addition, and something between 40 and 50 barns and houses out on the flat, and he could not tell you the number, because he had never once written any of it down. His father Torbjörn had come over from Voss in 1881 with a broad axe and a Bible and no English, and had gotten by for 4 years by being the only man in the township who could hew a straight sill, which is a thing a man can do without speaking. Halvor was 53 in the fall of 1943. He had a bad ear from a threshing machine in 1919. A separator cylinder had thrown a stone, and the concussion had gone through the side of his head like a door slamming. And after that the world came to him on the left side only. He had a wife named Ingeborg for 26 years, and then he did not. She died in the spring of 1938 of something the doctor in Voss Prairie called a weakness, and the doctor in Grand Forks called nothing at all. And after her funeral he painted the kitchen, because he could not think what else to do with his hands. There were no children. There had been one in 1919 for 11 days. By October of 1943 there were, in the whole of the county, 4 men under the age of 35 who were not in uniform, and 2 of those were the Fede brothers, who had a farm deferment and 140 milk cows to justify it. Everybody else's men were gone. The elevator at Voss Prairie was being run by a woman of 61. The mail was carried by a boy of 15 who was counting the months, and Halvor Skjelstad was at home and had a shop full of tools and nothing whatsoever to do. That is not quite true. He had work. In a county where the men were gone, there was more work than there had ever been, and none of it was work anybody would pay for, because the money had gone with the men, and what came back came in a government envelope and was spoken for before it arrived. He fixed the church steps. He fixed the Fede brothers' loading chute and would not take the $4. He sat in the shop in the evenings with the radio on his good side and rolled a nail between 2 fingers and listened to a man in New York describe a place in the ocean he could not have found on a globe. In April of 1942, Along with every other man in America born before February of 1897, he had gone into Voss Prairie and registered. They called it the old man's registration. It was not a draft. Nobody was going to send a man of 52 to the Solomon Islands, and everybody knew it. It was a survey of what the country had left. And what the country had left was men like him. And the whole point of it was to find out where they could be put. So when the notice came around in August of 1943, that the shipyards on Puget Sound wanted joiners and ship carpenters and would pay the fare out, Halvor put on his good coat and drove the 11 miles into town with his registration card in his shirt pocket. The board sat in the back of the Voss Prairie post office at a table with a green cloth on it. Gunnar Voland sat in the middle because he owned the lumber yard and had a telephone and had served on every committee the township had ever formed. He was 58, heavy through the shoulders, careful, and not an unkind man. He had carried the Skjelstad account through the whole of 1932 and never once sent a bill. He read the card. He asked Halvor to stand at the end of the table and turn his head. And then he said a word, and then he said it again louder, and Halvor watched his mouth and got it the second time. Voland wrote something and did not look up. They'll not take you with that ear, Halvor. Not on a ship deck. Man doesn't hear a signal, man gets somebody killed. I hear fine on the left. That's not what the form asks. There were 4 other men in the room, and one of them was Dorval Akri, who ran the feed store and had a way of repeating things. Voland pushed the card back across the green cloth and said, to the card and not to the man, that they were only being asked to certify the ones who could be placed, and that the rest of it, and here he moved his hand across the table in a way that took in the county, the men left in it, and Halvor Skjelstad standing at the end of the table with his hat in both hands. The rest of it was surplus. He meant labor. He meant a category on a form printed in Washington. There was nothing in his voice at all. Dorval Akri had it around the county before the week was out. And by the middle of September, there was not a man at the elevator who did not know it, and it had gotten shorter the way these things do. Surplus Skjelstad. It was not even said cruelly most times. That was the part that took the skin off. A man can stand being laughed at. What Halvor could not find any way to stand was that they said it kindly. The way you would say a thing about a piece of equipment that had been pulled out to the fence line and left there. No malice in it, no heat, just an agreed-upon fact about a thing that was no longer needed. Nobody was cruel to him that whole autumn. Nobody was much of anything to him. He went into the feed store and was served politely, and second, here is what he did with that. 2 weeks after the meeting at the post office on a Tuesday, Halvor drove out to look at the Aslaksen place, because he had heard the well pump was giving trouble, and Ragnhild Aslaksen was 74, and her son was at a gunnery school in Texas. The pump he fixed in 20 minutes. But standing in the yard afterward, wiping his hands, he looked up at the house the way he had looked up at houses his whole life, without deciding to, and he saw the ridge. It had a sag in it, not much, a hand's width maybe, over a span of 26 feet, and you would only see it if you had spent 31 years looking at ridgelines against the sky. He walked the yard to get the light behind it and confirmed it, and then he stood there a long moment with his hands hanging. A sagging ridge in that country in October is not a repair. It is a countdown. Because here is what the valley did to a roof. In the Red River Valley, the snow does not fall so much as travel. It comes down modest, and then it moves, week after week, on a wind with nothing between it and Saskatchewan, and it piles where the wind is broken. It piles on the lee slope of a roof and nowhere else. So a plains roof does not carry an even blanket the way a roof in the east does. It carries 40 pounds to the square foot on one side and 8 on the other, and the load tries to push the whole frame sideways like a man leaning on a card table. What holds a roof against that is not the rafters. It is the collar ties across them, and the braces standing under the purlins, and above all the ties down at the plate that keep the walls from spreading. Because when a plains roof goes, it almost never breaks in the middle. It splits the building open at the top of the wall, and the ridge drops straight down between the two halves like something sitting. The Aslaksen house had been built in 1904 by a man in a hurry with a green lumber budget. Its ties were nailed, not lapped and bolted, and 39 winters of that sideways push had drawn every one of them a little. The sag Halvor saw was not the roof getting tired. It was the walls, a half inch at a time, letting go of each other. He told Ragnhild Aslaksen nothing about it. She had $400 in the world and a boy in Texas. He went home, he ate, he sat in the shop until 11 with the lamp off, which was a thing he had gotten in the habit of. Then he loaded the truck. He worked that first night from about midnight until 4:45, and he did it by feel and lantern light, and by knowing the sound a nail makes when it finds old wood and goes true. He put in 6 collar ties of 2x6, lapped past each other and bolted through with carriage bolts he had bought in 1936 for a job that never happened. He set 2 braces up under the north purlin and let them down onto the ceiling joists over the bearing partition, which is the only place in a house like that where a brace has anything worth standing on. He hauled every stick up a ladder on his shoulder, one at a time, 53 years old, in the dark in October, with the north wind coming across 4 miles of stubble. He was down and gone before the yard light at the Fed place came on. Ragnhild Aslaksen never knew. She was 74 and her hearing was worse than his, and she slept at the front of the house. And she went out the next morning to her chickens and did not look up, because nobody looks up at their own roof. That was the first one. He did not have a plan then. He has to be given that. There was no list, no map, no idea of 9 of anything. There was one old woman with a boy in Texas and a ridge that was going to come down on her before spring, and a man with a truck and no work and a hole in his evenings. You could have driven the truck through. The rest of it came the way work comes to a man who has never in his life been able to walk past a thing that is broken. The Ristad porch was the 4th. By the middle of November, he had done the Aslaksen ridge, the Halvland roof over the kitchen wing, a floor sill at the Bratley place where the porch post had been standing in dirt since Coolidge, and Clarice Ristad's front porch, which he had done partly because it was dangerous, and partly because he had watched her carry a 5-gallon can up those steps in September and had thought about it for 2 months. And then he ran into the war. Nails in the fall of 1943 were steel, and steel was a weapon. The order out of the War Production Board that spring had cut civilian nail production to a fraction of what it had been in 1941, and what came through went to farm and defense work on a priority certificate. In that order, and Ransby County had 1 hardware store and 1 lumber yard, and both of them had bare hooks where the kegs used to stand. Roll roofing was scarce and cedar shingles were scarcer. Men banked their houses with straw and manure and tar paper the way their fathers had and did not think about it. And a 53-year-old carpenter with no job, no priority rating, and no reason on paper to be buying anything could walk into a store in that county and buy, in a good week, a pound of 8-penny nails and whatever a man might reasonably be putting up a fence with. So he did what everybody's grandfather did. He pulled old nails and straightened them on a piece of railroad iron in the shop. An hour at a stretch, a coffee can at his elbow, sorting by size the way another man might sort tackle. He tore down what was already dead. A corn crib on the home place, the granary his father had built in 1897, a hog shed. He took the wood a board at a time and let each one tell him what it still had. He did not touch new lumber for the first 5 jobs. Then, in the second week of December, he patched the north slope of the Halvland roof with what he had, which was reclaimed roll roofing off the crib, laid over 3 courses of shingle he could not replace. It held for 19 days. It came apart in a wet, warm rain the week after Christmas, the kind that comes once a winter in that valley and does more damage than the cold ever does. And Ottilie Halvland woke on the 28th of December to water running down the inside of her kitchen wall in a sheet, into the flour bin, into the crock she kept her eggs in. Halvor heard about it at the feed store. He stood with a sack of scratch grain on his shoulder and listened to Dorval Akre tell it, and he did not put the sack down, and he did not say anything, and his face did not do anything either, which was the worst hour of that whole autumn for him, because the framing had held. The framing he had put in was fine. What had failed was the skin over it, the tar paper and the tired shingles. The part he had known was wrong when he laid it, and had laid anyway because it was that or nothing. And now the woman was worse off than before. Before it had leaked in one place, and she had put a bucket there, and known where the bucket went. He had given her a whole wall, and there was not one thing he could do about it. That did not mean standing in her kitchen with his hat off, and saying his own name. That was the shape of it, and it did not get better. This was the cost of the way he had chosen to work. A man who signs his work can go back and fix it. A man who does not sign it has to stand at the feed store with a sack on his shoulder and listen. He waited 9 days. Then on the 6th of January in 11 degrees, he went back to the Halvor place in the dark and stripped the whole north slope down to the sheathing and laid new roll roofing over it, all of it, every square foot. Roofing that had come off a rail car in Grand Forks with a farm priority on it. Roofing that had cost more than he was going to admit to himself. Roofing that Gunnar Volan had ordered, stacked in the shed behind the lumberyard, and had not yet counted. Roll roofing in the winter of 1944 did not simply sit in a shed. It sat in a shed against a number in a book. Gunnar Volan had ordered 11 rolls in November against farm priority certificates. And by the middle of January there were 9. And a keg of 8-penny nails that had been opened by somebody who was not him. He was not a suspicious man. He counted it again, waited 2 weeks, and counted a third time on the 4th of February, and by then there were 7 rolls, and 110 feet of 2x6 had gone out of the rack by the north wall, and he sat down on a nail keg in the cold with the book on his knee, and understood that he was being stolen from. That was the thing Halvor had not thought through, and it is the thing nobody thinks through. He had left money. He had left it every single time. He would figure the job at the yard price he knew, as well as Volan did, round it up, put the coins and the bills in a plain envelope with nothing written on it, and push it under the office door on his way out at 4 in the morning. 6 times by February. Every one of them over, most of them well over, because he was not going to be the man who guessed low. But an envelope of money pushed under a door in the dark does not say what it is for. It says only that somebody has been in the yard. Volan never once connected the two. He had the envelopes in the safe and no idea what they were, and he had a shed with things walking out of it. And by the 3rd week of February, the county had a word for what was happening. And the word was not surplus. I want to say something here, before the winter closes in on this story, because I think it's the part worth carrying out of it. There is an old idea that a good deed done in secret is the purest kind. I have never entirely believed that, and the reason I have never believed it is sitting in that lumber yard on a nail keg with a book on his knee. Kindness that hides itself does not stop being kindness. It just stops being able to explain itself, and somebody else has to hold the difference. If a story like this one is the sort you'd want to hear more of, the subscribe button is right there, and I'll keep finding them. By March, Dorval Acre had a theory. A theory travels when it has a shape to it, and this one had a shape. Somebody with a truck. Somebody who knew lumber well enough to take the good pieces and leave the culls behind. Because whoever it was had been very particular indeed. Somebody who was out at night and had nobody at home to ask him where he had been. He never said the name. He did not have to. What Halvor noticed that spring was that the politeness got a half-degree cooler. He was still served at the feed store. He was still served second. But now there was a small pause in the room when he came in, a hitch. The way a conversation steps over a crack in a floor, and a man of 54 who has been listening with one ear for 25 years knows exactly what that hitch sounds like. He could have ended it in 90 seconds. He could have walked into the lumberyard office and said, "Those are mine, and here is what they were for, and here is a list of 9 houses you can go look at." He did not, and it would be easy to make that noble, and it was not entirely noble. Part of it was that Ragnhild Aslaksen and Ottilie Hovland and Clarice Ristad had spent that winter believing, each of them privately, that they had somehow been lucky, and luck is a thing a proud woman can accept. Charity is not. He had watched Ottilie Hovland tell 4 people that her roof had held up better than she had any right to expect, and there had been a straightness in her when she said it that he was not willing to take away from her for the sake of his own comfort at the feed store. And part of it, if we are being honest about the man, was pride of the ordinary kind. He had been called surplus in a room with a green cloth on the table. He was not going to go back into that room and ask to be believed. So he did the only thing he had ever done with anything. He worked. Through the spring and summer of 1944 he did 4 more. The Bratley kitchen sill finished properly. The fed milkhouse, a set of rafters over the Skorpen porch, and in August, the 9th, which was Signe Onstad's. Signe Onstad was 77 and had buried a husband, and in 1918, 2 of her 4 children in 11 days. She lived alone on 40 acres at the edge of the Dovre Slough, with a stove, a dog, and an opinion about everything. And she was the only person in Ransby County who had never once in her life been polite to Halvor Skjelstad, which he found restful. Her house sat low and wrong. It had been banked every autumn for 40 years the way they all were. Straw and manure heaped against the foundation to the height of the sills and tarpaper tacked over it to hold the frost out of the crawl space, so the ground under the house would not freeze and heave and rack the frame. But somewhere in the 20s the banking had stopped being done properly, and the northeast corner had lifted 3 inches over 3 winters. And a house that has lifted at one corner has a roof that is being asked to be a shape it is not. He took 9 nights on that one. It was the worst work he had done, because the fix was down in the crawl space on his back in the dark with a hydraulic jack and cribbing, and every quarter turn had to sit for a night, and he did not dare take more than a 1/16 of an inch at a time, or the plaster would have come off the walls over the old woman while she slept. On the 7th night, coming out from under the house at 3:30, he found Sinje Onstad sitting on a kitchen chair in the yard in her coat with the dog beside her. They looked at each other for a while. "There's coffee," she said. "It's from Tuesday." He drank it. She did not ask him one single question. What she did instead was tell him, in her flat way, that the muskrats out on the slough had built their lodges half again as high as she had ever seen them, and that the geese had gone through in the 3rd week of August, which was 19 days early, and that the last time she had seen both of those things in the same year was 1896, and he could do with that what he liked. Then she took the cup back and went inside and let him finish. He believed her, not because a muskrat knows anything, but because a woman who has lived 77 years on the edge of a slough has been keeping a record whether she knows it or not. And a record is a record. So in September and October of 1944, Halvor Skjelstad went back around to all 9. He did not add anything new. He went back and checked every bolt he had set, sistered 2 rafters at the Scorpion place he had not been happy with, and rebanked 3 foundations with his own straw hauled in his own truck at his own cost in the dark. And on the 14th of November, 1944, at about 2 in the afternoon, the wind went around into the northwest, and it began. They talked about that storm in Ransby County for 40 years afterward. It came in on a Tuesday with the temperature at 31 degrees, and it did not stop for 61 hours. And what made it what it was the water in it. The first 8 hours were wet, and the wet snow packed and then froze. And after that the ground blizzard came over the top of it. By Thursday morning there were drifts on the lee side of every building in the county that stood 11 and 12 feet. And they were not the light stuff. They were plaster. Snow that has thawed once and frozen again weighs more than 3 times what fresh snow weighs, and it does not slide. That is the load a plane's roof was never built for. That is the load that finds every tie that was nailed instead of bolted, every purlin standing on nothing, every wall that has spent 40 winters being pushed sideways a ½ inch at a time. The Fede brothers lost the roof off the old horse barn at about 4 in the morning on the 15th. They heard it go from the house, a crack and then a long soft sound, like something enormous sitting down in deep water. In Voss Prairie, the roof of the skating shelter folded. Out on the county line, the Torvik granary came apart at the plate exactly the way a plains building comes apart, splitting open at the top of the walls with the ridge dropping straight down between the halves. Clarice Ristad spent the night of the 15th in her kitchen with a lamp, listening to the house. Anybody who has been alone in a bad one knows that you do not listen for the wind. The wind is only weather, and it goes on being weather all night. What you listen for is the building, the particular knock a rafter makes, when the load on it changes, the long complaint out of a wall plate, the sound a nail makes coming out of dry pine 1/8 of an inch, which is a small dry sound like a word being cleared out of a throat. She knew that house. She had lived in it for 6 years and had heard it in 3 previous winters. And she knew that when the northeast wind loaded it, the upstairs door swung shut by itself, every time, because the frame went out of square just enough. That night the door stayed where she had left it. She kept the lamp low and the stove going, and she made coffee at 11 and again at 2, and once near 1 in the morning, the whole county made a sound she never afterward found any way to describe. A crack somewhere off to the south, and then a long soft settling, which was the Torvik granary going, though she did not know it then. She stood up when it came. She stood there with a cup in her hand and waited for her own ceiling to answer it. It did not. Above her, the frame of a badly built 1911 farmhouse worked and ticked and did not do anything else at all. She had 11 letters from her husband in a box on the shelf, and a wind outside that took the words out of your mouth. At some point after 2 in the morning, she went out onto the porch, into the lee, and stood there in the dark with the whole county roaring, and she put her hand flat on the porch post, the way you would put your hand on the neck of a horse. She would say later that she had not been frightened after about midnight, and that she could not tell you why. The house simply did not feel like a thing that was going to come down. She put that at the time to the way she had been raised, and to the letters, and to the fact that a person cannot stay afraid for 61 hours. It was not any of that. It was 6 pieces of 2x6 she had never laid eyes on, carried up a ladder over her head, one at a time in October on a shoulder she would never have guessed at. The storm blew itself out on Friday afternoon. It took 9 days to open the roads. The county agent's damage report was read out in the basement of the Lutheran church at Voss Prairie on the 28th of November, because that was where anything got read out. 31 buildings in Ransby County damaged or destroyed, 4 houses uninhabitable, 2 barns down complete, 1 creamery loading dock, the skating shelter, 11 granaries and corn cribs, and a machine shed at the Acre place with a new tractor under it. Nobody in that basement was counting the other way. Nobody ever does. It takes a particular kind of mind to sit in a room where a list of ruin is being read and notice the pattern in what is not on the list. Gunnar Volan had that kind of mind, because he had spent 30 years selling the material that buildings are made of, and he had spent 9 months before that trying to figure out where his roll roofing went. He went home that night and got the book out. It took him until about 1 in the morning. 9 houses were not on the list. 9. And every one of them a place where the man was gone, and every one of them a place where something had been quietly different that winter, and when he laid the dates of the missing lumber beside the dates of what he could remember hearing, he had it. Then he opened the safe and took out the envelopes, which were still exactly where he had put them, 11 of them by then, and he sat at his kitchen table and counted the money. It came to $241.80. He counted it a second time because he did not believe the first count. The yard price of everything that had gone out of that shed, figured at what he himself would have charged, with the war markup, came to $196 and change. The following Sunday there was a supper in the church basement, the kind with 3 kinds of scalloped corn and a coffee urn that had been there since the Wilson administration. Volan stood up at the end of it, which he did 4 or 5 times a year, and people put their forks down. He said the lumber yard had not been robbed. He said there had been a matter over the winter, and that he had let people talk about it longer than he should have, and that he had gone through his book and found that every board and every roll and every keg had been paid for. Then he took the envelopes out of his coat pocket and put them down on the table beside the coffee urn, in a stack, and left his hand on them. "I counted it twice," he said. "It's over." That was all he said. He sat back down. Halvor Skjelstad was at the second table from the door with a plate of scalloped corn in front of him. Nobody looked at him. That is the part that ought to be said plainly. Nobody looked at him, then or afterward, and Gunnar Volan never spoke a word to him about it, for the rest of his life. And whether Volan knew or only suspected is a thing that went into the ground with him in 1961. One person in Ransby County knew for certain. In August, she had driven out to the Onstad place at 6 in the morning with a setting of eggs, because Sine Onstad's hens had quit, and Sine Onstad was not going to ask anybody for anything. The Dovre Slough road runs straight for 2.5 miles there, the slough lying open on the north side of it, and there is nowhere on that road a person can be that is not in plain sight of everywhere else on it. She came over the little rise by the culvert, and there was a truck coming toward her out of the gray, and she knew the truck. Everybody in the township knew that truck. It had a sideboard on the right that had been replaced with a different wood and never painted, and it had been that way since 1936. In the bed of it, riding loose, were a jack and a stack of cribbing blocks, and a lantern with the globe still warm enough to be fogged. She pulled over onto the grass to let him by, which is what you do on a road like that. He went past her at about 8 miles an hour, with both hands on the wheel, and his head turned exactly straight ahead, and she understood, watching him do it, that he had seen her a quarter mile back and had spent that quarter mile deciding to look at nothing. She sat on the grass with the eggs on the seat beside her until the sound of him was gone. Then she went on to Sine Onstad's and gave her the eggs and drank a cup of coffee that had been made on Tuesday. And neither of those two women said one word about the fresh cribbing blocks stacked under the northeast corner of the house, which were the only new wood on the place. She thought about it every day for 4 months. She thought about her own porch. She thought about the fact that she had $1.16 in the sugar bowl on the 9th of October, 1943, and that whoever had been out there had known it, the way people in a small county know things, and had come anyway and gone away without letting her thank him. And she understood eventually that the thanking was the part he could not have carried. She never asked him. She never told anybody. What she did do in December of 1944 was leave a jar of chokecherry syrup on the step of his shop with no note, because the man had made a religion out of not signing his work, and it seemed to her that the least she could do was answer him in his own language. He kept the empty jar on the shop windowsill. It was still there in 1958. Odd Ristad came home in October of 1945, thin, with a duffel and a hearing problem of his own from the guns. He walked up onto his own porch and set the duffel down and stood there a minute the way men did, and then he crouched and put his hand on the third board. "Somebody fixed this," he said. "Somebody did," said his wife. That was the whole of it. She had 39 years left with the man, and she never told him. And I have thought about that a good deal, whether that was a kindness or something a little harder to name. I think she understood that the porch was not hers to explain. Halvor Skjelstad worked another 19 years. When the men came home, there was a building boom in that valley like nothing since 1910, and by 1948, he had a crew of 6 and more work than he could take, and nobody in Ransby County ever again used the word surplus about him or anybody else, because the word had gone out of style along with the war it came from. He died in 1963. Ottilie Hovland's house stood until 1997. Signe Onstad's is still standing, and the northeast corner is still level. And here is the part I like. In the summer of 1979, a carpenter out of Grand Forks was cutting an opening for a stairway in the Aslaksen house, which had been sold twice by then, and he pulled the ceiling down and stopped and called his partner over. There were 6 collar ties up there, where a house of that age and that size would have had 4, lapped past each other and bolted through, and 2 braces standing under the north purlin, and the whole assembly was heavier than anything the building could possibly need. They stood on the ladder looking at it. "There's a lot of extra in this roof," the partner said. That is what it got called, after that, by the 2 or 3 men in that part of the valley who ran into it in more than one house and started asking each other about it. Extra surplus framing, nobody knew whose it was. They only knew it turned up in old houses out on the Dover Slough Road. Always the same hand, always more than the code of any year has ever asked for, and that in 120 years of weather, not one of those roofs has come down. A word can be put on a man in a back room with a green cloth on the table, and it can follow him around a small county for years, and there is not one thing he can do about it by arguing. But a word is only a container. What finally goes in it is decided by the work. I have known a few men like this one, in the sense that anybody knows anybody, the kind who cannot walk past a broken thing, who would rather be thought a thief than be thanked in public, who measure their own worth in whether a roof is still up, rather than in whether anybody remembers who put it there. There is not much room for that kind of man now. Everything wants a name on it. Still, somewhere out on that flat black valley there are houses with more bracing in them than they need, and nobody living knows why, and the roofs are still on. That seems to me like a fine way to be remembered by a place, even if the place has forgotten who you were. The story you have just heard is fiction. The people, the town and the county in it were invented for the telling, though the winters, the trades and the shortages behind it were real enough for the people who lived them.